Welcome everybody. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all sitting on today. For me, I'm in Canberra and I'm sitting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and particularly respects to emerging elders, and to recognise the ongoing contribution that First Nations people play in the life of this country. Today, I'm really delighted that we're joined by Warren Cann, the CEO of the Parenting Research Centre. Warren is a psychologist and he has held the position of CEO at PRC since 2002. During this time, the PRC has been recognised nationally and internationally for the strengths of their applied research, capacity building strategies and programs. Warren has extensive experience in helping policymakers and organisational leaders bring scientific rigour to the practical task of improving the effectiveness of services and supports provided to children and their families. And that's the basis of our talk today. Warren is a fountain of wisdom in this space, and we are delighted, as I said, to have him with us as part of ARACY's webinar series today. Thank you for your time, Warren, and over to you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Penny, and thank you to you and to ARACY for inviting me into your cyberspace. I really appreciate it. Can I just say I haven't done that many webinars before, so just bear with me while I get a hang of it. I must admit it takes a little bit of practice to sort of get over the idea that you're just not sitting here in a room talking to yourself, but there's obviously all the names in the attendees list, so I'm reassured there are people on the other end, and I really appreciate you coming to hear this talk. We had a number of events earlier in the year in Sydney and Melbourne where we presented some of these ideas, and there seemed to be quite a lot of interest in them, and we thought that perhaps we could share some of these ideas more broadly with a wider audience using something like a webinar. So we really are grateful to be able to work with ARACY in partnering to do this. I just wanted to begin by acknowledging that a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today has been done in partnership with a whole range of really amazing people and organisations. It goes back probably nearly 15 years, and as you can see from that list, there have been many agencies from many different fields of work who've been involved in this journey that we're on about evidence and how we bring evidence into practice in a practical way, how we make evidence work for children and families. And this is a journey, I guess, that I've been on for a very long time, I have to say. I found this from a book from a bit of a hero of mine back when I was studying psychology, Meichenbaum. And this is a description of the treatment that Charles II received from the very best physicians of the day. You can tell, looking from that treatment, that he was fairly seriously ill. I'm not sure whether it was the Bezoar stones that finally got him in the end, but in the end, despite this very extensive treatment, he died and was probably greatly relieved to do so. I think not just this, but at a very early stage, I was very much impressed with the power of science to bring about positive changes for people. I think we could agree that even though science has not always produced great things for humanity or even for the globe, there are lots of ways in which science has made a very real contribution to our lives. After all, this was the way you used to have a tooth removed, and now we get to enjoy something that looks a bit like this, and this is because of the work of science. And yet the reality is for us on the ground is that true innovation and evidence don't always go hand in hand. It can be a bit of an up and down process. Here's an example. I'm not sure exactly why this amazing invention didn't take off. I can imagine a fair few harried working mothers and fathers who could do with a bit of technical assistance getting ready for work. And I'm not sure why Professor Eugene Mack didn't get a Nobel Peace Prize for this one, but it didn't catch on or didn't take off as far as I'm aware. And so even innovations that are put forward by individuals as eminent as this professor don't always catch on, and in the end probably aren't all that evidence-based. On a more serious note, we still often see and I guess struggle with ineffective, potentially even harmful interventions that are being propagated in the family and child space despite a complete lack of evidence or even evidence to the contrary. Here's one example of a non-evidence-based approach, which is hyperbaric chamber treatment of children with autism. And of course, families are vulnerable to a hard sell, can end up spending lots of money on interventions that really are not effective. And it just prompts me to mention pseudoscience, because in a day when everybody is talking about evidence, one emerging risk is pseudoscience. That is when things look scientific but in fact aren't scientific, and the use of scientific equipment in particular is often a sign of a pseudoscientific approach. In the last 20 years, the Parenting Research Centre has been involved in thinking about how best to disseminate evidence-based practice. We have seen significant changes. We have seen a move away from eminence-based practice to evidence-based practice. We've seen evidence-based practice be taken on board, embraced by organisations, by governments at all levels. And in fact, you could probably safely say that evidence-based practice is pretty much the norm at the moment. It's what is expected. And yet there are real challenges that remain in how to make evidence-based practice a reality. In fact, I very rarely encounter resistance to the idea of delivering things that work to children and families. But where the challenges and where the friction can arise is around the manner or the way that evidence is being translated into practice, how we're using, how we're applying evidence, and some of those challenges are very practical. So in the child and family space in particular, pretty much evidence-based practice has come to reflect or represent products or programs. And so we hear about evidence-based programs, sometimes we hear about evidence-based practices, but really the space, our space anyway, is pretty much dominated by packaged or manualised programs. And of course, our centre has been involved in both developing programs and supporting programs, and there's definitely a place for parenting programs. There's certainly a lot of good, strong evidence that the right parenting program in the right place can make a significant difference for very many families and for their children. But I think that there is reason to think that just a very narrow program or product-focused approach to evidence-based practice might be leaving us a little short of achieving our vision of really making evidence a reality in all services that work with children and families. So I just thought I might review some of those challenges that we encounter, particularly when we do adopt an approach which is based on, purely based on the selection of programs and use of programs. The first challenge that we face in the field, and that certainly policymakers face, is that evidence-based interventions don't always exist for the population or the outcome of interest. Despite the burgeoning research, and it just increases every year, there are areas of child wellbeing and development, there are populations that simply won't have had the opportunity to either participate in the development of programs or to have those programs evaluated. And I think many of our Indigenous colleagues and friends would remind us that many programs that we consider evidence-based have never actually been evaluated in Indigenous communities. And so the question there is, the program might work, but in what settings does it work, and can we assume that it's going to work in all settings? Another challenge that's faced by policymakers and practitioners and service managers is judging claims about what works. Evidence is a contested area. Evidence is always changing and developing. despite the various attempts at rating the strength of evidence, we haven't really come on a methodology that I think is particularly kind of accurate or all that helpful. And so when we think about policymakers that need to make decisions about programs they're going to fund or practitioners about what programs they're going to implement, it can be challenging working through the vast array of material that can be put out there. Here's an example, for goodness sake, if the Sodapop Board of America can't get it right, who can get it right? Clearly children should be drinking Coke and should start as early as possible. And then there are definitely occasions where we haven't always been able to rely on the experts for getting solid advice, which is partly why we're moving away from the idea it's not just who says it, it's what the basis of what they say. And for many of us, you might have kind of encountered this, where evidence-based practice as a moniker is essentially being used as a sort of a marketing tool. Certainly program developers are under pressure to be able to demonstrate evidence for their programs, and the fact that it's evidence-based is something that's often used to promote programs, and sometimes difficult to assess the quality of evidence that sits behind that, or when we can safely say that a program is in fact evidence-based. And indeed, evidence is on a continuum, so that continuum of evidence means that it's not a simple matter of something either being in or being out. We just have varying strengths of evidence that apply in different situations. Okay, another challenge, I think, a real challenge for us in making evidence-based practice reality is the scientific process is very, very slow. In fact, the traditional scientific process looks a bit like this. A researcher develops an idea, pursues funding support through research funding organisations. If they're successful, they'll put together a program of research that attempts to demonstrate the efficacy of an intervention. Efficacy is really focused on the internal validity of an intervention. It's all about making sure that we can conclude something about the effect of the intervention as opposed to other extraneous influences. Typically, these are randomised controlled trials. And then the next step, if a strong, well-controlled trial proves promising, a researcher might get the opportunity to go to an effectiveness research program where they look at testing the program in real-life conditions. And then finally, they might move to more of a scaling up or dissemination research activity, which is about getting out the research, being out the practice of the program to a broader group. This kind of process can take years. It can take between 10 and 15 years. It's long and it's very slow, and things change in the meantime. But it also creates challenges. In fact, Stephen Hayes, who is a researcher who's renowned for his founding acceptance commitment therapy, pointed out in an article he wrote some time ago that in some ways this is a recipe for creating efficacious but practically useless interventions. That is because the development of these interventions doesn't occur in the settings in which they're designed to be implemented, and often ultimately prove very difficult to implement in a real-world setting. In fact, he made an argument that we should seriously consider thinking in the other way. That is, beginning really with community-based feasibility type, exploratory type work, and then if that work is proving to be promising, then adding a more rigorous level of evaluation over the top of that, and maybe if that proves promising, then go into even the more expensive and time-consuming efficacy trials. And I think he's got a really good point there, because I think no matter how effective an intervention is, if it's not able to be scaled or brought to scale, if there's never going to be the resource to make it happen, then it does make you wonder about the wisdom of putting lots of resource into developing it in the first place. And so this, related to that, is this challenge that many interventions are well engineered but poorly designed, often if they are particularly being driven from original research or from theory. and being delivered in and being designed in research settings, when it comes to getting them out into the real world, we can find difficulties occur, and the difficulties occur because the program or the approach simply doesn't align with the way the users, our intended audience, our intended target group are thinking, working, or accessing services or programs. So you get something like this. You get a kind of well-engineered, very sound kind of solution that nobody is using because it doesn't fit with their way of life or way of thinking. And you know, there's very much, and we have experienced this a lot in our work in the community, where we see, you know, strong evidence-based programs kind of sitting empty in community settings, whereas almost next door in the next community centre, you'll see very strongly subscribed programs that don't have a lot of evidence around them because people have not had the opportunity to evaluate them, but have really high acceptability. And engaging the community, engaging families more effectively than sometimes our capacity to bring people into interventions which were never kind of designed to fit in the ecology of a particular service or approach. And look, just while I'm on, just finally on challenges, I think another issue is about the science itself and how we think about the science around developing interventions. What's happened is that as the evidence-based movement has developed, we have seen intervention manuals essentially being treated as the unit of intervention. That is, we'll start with a particular, often quite narrow, perhaps psychosocial issue, family issue or child issue. We'll develop a intervention, put it into a protocol, and that's essentially what a program involves. It involves both a protocol and involves a set of active ingredients. And then we'll run a randomised controlled trial where we'll deliver the program to one group and then not to the other, and then we'll compare differences. And the conclusion is based on people's reluctance to sort of make, to draw conclusions from packaged programs. The conclusion will be that it was actually the manual, which is the active treatment. And of course, I don't think anybody really believes that, you know, that the mechanisms of delivery, for example, whether you hold it as a group or whether it's delivered individually or whether it's 10 weeks or 6 weeks, are as important as the actual active ingredients, the parts of the program which actually make a difference. But that's kind of where we end up getting stuck there. And that kind of drives this focus on fidelity, drives the focus on, I guess, program developers to become protective of their material, to want to ensure its quality delivery and build then a whole range of quality assurance mechanisms around that, you know, drives the proprietary kind of approach where we're seeing programs kind of get more and more locked behind paywalls, because that's really the only way the program deliverer or developer can get it out there and get it out there with the kind of quality supports they think is necessary. But, you know, an outcome here is that we're ending up with these very siloed research buckets. You know, we have research which is just being thought of as research relevant to a particular program. So, you know, you have now diagnosis and then a particular program and the research relates to that program. And we're it's prevented by this way of thinking for sort of thinking more broadly, perhaps more creatively about what does this research mean. But that is actually starting to happen. We're starting to see people break out a bit of their programming silos and start to think a little bit more differently about what research about programs actually means. Part of the observation that's driving this is that many programs are in fact remixes, or kind of remixes of each other. You know, have a lot of shared elements and are repackaging those elements in particular ways to suit particular groups or certain situations. But ultimately, many of the elements are in fact shared or come from a shared approach. It was Lipsy who kind of pointed out, and I thought this was really powerful, that when you think about a particular program, particular proprietary program in particular, you'll find that it belongs to a class of programs, which in turn belongs to a broader body of practice. And these programs are similar in their theoretical background, similar in their approach, similar in what they do, An example of this would be sort of behavioural family type programs. Programs like the Incredible Years, programs like Triple P, programs like Parenting Research Centres, Signpost program. They are very similar in their approach. There are subtle differences, of course, in the way they're packaged and presented and so on, but their core approach is very much the same. And I think people like Lipsy are now beginning to argue that we can start to think about evidence for programs, individual programs, as being evidence for particular approaches. And when we start to think like that, then we can start to think about what approaches have evidence and what classes of programs have evidence. And potentially we could also then conclude that, you know, homegrown, home-developed, locally developed interventions that share the same characteristics or same approach are likely to be successful because of the demonstrated evidence around other programs. So here's an example that Lipsy did around juvenile justice, where he looked at the different approaches that interventions targeting young people have had contact with the juvenile justice system. And I think this is really powerful research showing effective interventions have the characteristics of, on the graph on the right, whereas ineffective interventions tend to have the characteristics that are showing, you know, worse than no effects, actually negative effects, you know, discipline type approaches, or, you know, deterrence type approaches like scared and straight and so on. These interventions are not actually proving effective. This gives local program deliverers some flexibility in the way they develop and deliver their service, but also they can have a look at where the evidence sits in terms of overall approach. Another approach that you'll be seeing more around now is the common elements approach, where the recognition is that many we can begin to sort of identify what are these shared or common elements that are effective, then start to think about, well, how do we use those common elements but in tailored ways with the families or the children we serve. I'm also keen, I can't spend a lot of time on this, but just to point out the possibility of using published program evaluation research as benchmark data, and then taking and developing a community initiative, and at least in the early stages, to benchmark our results by comparing the results of our local initiative to the RCT-based research, if you like, perhaps using a similar measure. And whilst this doesn't establish scientific certainty, and that's not the point, what it would do is at least establish a prima facie case that a particular approach or adaptation has got potential, and I think that sits within the realm of what, you know, community agencies can do. So I think that we need to think more, when we think about evidence-based practice, we need to think more broadly than programs, and I think it's got to do with adopting evidence-based practice as a philosophy, as a process, not just as a product. And part of that is about adopting this core value of transparency, where we're committing to understand what we do and what the effects are of what we do. And we're committing to the idea of handling uncertainty and ignorance honestly, that we're prepared to enter a learning process that may teach us something about the limits of the effectiveness of what we do, as well as help us build the evidence base. And I think what this means is going back a little bit and recovering some of the original concept of evidence-based practice. And it was Sackett, really, in the health field, who kind of coined the term, and he was working, obviously, in medicine. And he developed this way of thinking about evidence-based practice. I'm sure you're familiar with this. There have been lots of iterations of this kind of way of thinking, basically bringing together best available scientific evidence, combining it with practitioner know-how and skill, and then adapting that to adapting the evidence to, you know, to client values and preferences. Sometimes you'll see this being represented as a way of developing an evidence-based program, but really what this was a way of tailoring solutions to individuals, working with individuals to help them find solutions to their problems. And if you like, evidence-based practice is the thing that's happening in that orange dot there, right in the middle of that combination. This kind of way of thinking just, I think, really reinforces the critical role of practitioners, that without practitioners bringing their skill set to this process, clients won't be able to access evidence in a meaningful way, won't be able to adapt it and apply it. And it's critical, that role that practitioners play in that sort of adapting, tailoring process is absolutely critical. And of course, the need to ensure that we're working with clients in a way that's consistent with their values and beliefs is critical as well. And so where we've got to is an interest in supporting organisations to do this, because not everybody can deliver programs. I mean, case managers have to work with the people who come through the door. Maternal and child health nurses have to work with people who come through the door, GPs and others. They all have to work through, they all have to work with the people who show up, who present seeking help, and they can't always divert them into a particular program. And this is where we think there is some significant potential offered through the idea of practice frameworks. Now, practice frameworks are not new. I mean, if you go to a library and look in the social work section, Social Work 101, you'll find lots of practice frameworks. But one thing I'd say about practice frameworks is that many end up just sitting on shelves and don't actually make a difference on the ground. And secondly, many practice frameworks tend to be fairly general and principle-based. And I think for lots of practitioners, they don't get the kind of guidance around their actual behavioural practice that they are often looking for or could benefit from. So we've been involved now on a number of occasions in helping people develop practice frameworks, and we do that to help their organisations make the how they work more explicit, to operationalise practice. And it's about creating a common language so that people can talk about the process of what they're doing in a coherent way, because they're sharing a common way of describing where their families are at and what it is that they're trying to do and their way they work with families. And then it's about making practice knowledge accessible, because often it just resides in people's heads. It resides in the heads of practitioners. And the idea of a practice framework owned at the level of an organisation is to bring practice knowledge into the organisation. And that makes it accessible, that makes it shareable, and it also means that we can systematically develop it and systematically build on it when we've done that piece of work. And the thing about a practice framework, which I think is powerful, is it fits nicely in a kind of continuous quality improvement framework, where we start with what we're doing, and we start with the process of exploring, and then we start discovering new things, and then we start making small changes, and then we start delivering those changes, and we learn about the effects of those changes. And what we do is build the quality of what we're doing over time, which after all, that's what good practice requires. You can't just get it in a training program or a workshop. It's a lifetime. It's a lifetime's work improving and developing your practice. The sort of process that we're doing, and we're not sort of saying it's the only way to do it by any means, but this is a process that we adapted from the fantastic work of Funnel and Rogers in program logic evaluation. Have developed a kind of stepwise process that kind of allows us to work with organisations where they're at now, help them clarify what it is that they're trying to achieve. And this involves the development of logic models and program logics, and I can almost hear the groans over the internet. Everybody's, I guess, been involved in that kind of process. But what we've actually found is that many traditional, particularly kind of pipeline program logic models obscure the actual mechanisms of change, and what's really critical is to have an understanding of how do we think this program works. So this process is about learning what we think about how this program works, and then it's about then going to the evidence to go, well, can we augment this, can we develop it, can we improve it, and then it's going to look at the actual activities of the intervention of the program and refining those activities and intervention. But it's sort of the same model that can divide, that can guide the development of our intervention, also then provides a really valuable framework for thinking about continuous quality improvement. And when we measure some of these important outcomes, like intended outcomes, like mediating outcomes, things that we are seeking to change in order to get our intended outcomes, or we're tracking our implementation outcomes, for example, we start to measure those things, and we now have the basis of a potentially very powerful continuous improvement and data-informed measurement system that helps us keep learning and improving our practice. And by the way, I totally agree with Funnel and Rogers on this, that if we can collect data in each of these purple boxes, and if we can confirm that we did what we said we were going to do, we achieved the engagement we said we were going to achieve, we achieved the mediating outcomes, the mechanisms of change, and then we actually achieve the intended outcomes, we can make a pretty powerful impact statement, I think, about what it is that we're doing and what results it has. I mean, yes, there are scientific limitations to that statement, but from the point of view of what an organisation on the ground would be wanting to be able to show, I think this is a really potentially very rigorous and very useful sort of paradigm to work in. Don't read this. This is an example working with our great friends at Windermere, our colleagues at Windermere, where we took an outcomes chaining approach. The idea was to really get very, very clear about what, how our intervention worked, how our implementation outcomes related to our ultimate intended outcomes, and to be able to draw if this then that relationships between the different elements. These outcomes chains are proving to be very powerful. They create a kind of conceptual map for practitioners, but they also provide obviously a ready-made guide for thinking about, you know, continuous quality improvement based evaluations or any evaluation, because we have nutted out our thinking about how it is that we achieve positive change. And once we're clear on that, almost all of our practice frameworks have required us to sort of sit together and think about, you know, what does our practice look like, you know, and mainly it's been about, you know, what does collaborative practice look like, and it means trying to operationalize in a really practical way what a collaborative relationship looks like, how it is that you act in a collaborative way, how it is that you deal with challenges in a collaborative way, and trying to get to the point where we can get more specific and beyond general principles, you know, that we're all very familiar with and we embrace, like family-centered practice or strength-based practice, to be able to pinpoint actually what does that look like so that I can recognise it and I can replicate it. Another key element of practice framework is the development of an overarching practice architecture. In the end, for many of the frameworks that we've developed, the architecture has been built on a series of phases, which involve working people through a change process supported by phases. The phases have a kind of a particular focal point. They provide a kind of guide to practitioners about where to focus their attention, where to focus their energy. They also provide a very useful kind of troubleshooting mechanism, because if problems are encountered in later phases, that's often because earlier phases may have been incomplete or require revisiting before we move forward. So this is one kind of phased approach we adapted from Canfor and Chef from some of their seminal work in the late 1980s, but you might be familiar with this kind of approach. I've even had people interested and involved in sort of organisational change kind of recognise these things as kind of common kind of phases in supporting a change process. So a practice architecture like this has the potential of creating a backbone. And then what we do is we bring in evidence-based content elements. And so this is where I think the sort of concept, the concept of evidence-based elements really sort of fits really nicely, because rather than it just kind of being a kind of slightly odd and I don't know, random selection of elements, potentially what people can do is they can bring core approaches to particular issues that, say, a child and family might be facing, and then bring that approach into an overarching guide to working with families. And if you think about it, the phases are all about how you might support a change process, whereas the evidence-based content elements are the kind of ideas, strategies or resources the family might end up drawing on to achieve their goals. And so we now say or talk about evidence-based content elements, which are about sort of, I guess, the content of a intervention, and evidence-based process elements, which are about what it is that we do to support the change process. It's about what does our helping process look like and what are the best helping techniques that we can use. Although I should hurry to add here that here we're often drawing on art as well as science, in the sense that practice is as much art as it is science. And then I think a real practice framework is a living organism. It's not just something we develop once and implement. It's something that we want to keep developing. And ideally, if we're working within an evidence-based framework, ideally what we'll be doing is bringing data to the table. We'll be asking ourselves, is what we're doing working to achieve the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve? And we think a practice framework works more effectively where meaningful data is collected and then shared with the people who are in a position to use it. That is the practitioners, that is the program managers and leaders of agencies and organisations who can use the data to help drive continual improvement approaches. And what this requires is the development of practical measures. It requires the development of practical technologies and systems for capturing data, and that involves really carefully thinking about how do we present data back to the people who could use it. Not everybody is comfortable kind of looking at tables of data, but data visualization techniques, techniques that turn information into intelligence can be potentially very helpful when we have a program and a group of staff sitting around asking themselves, how do you think we're going? Are we hitting our implementation targets? Are we hitting our outcomes? Where do we need to change, and so on? And that means thinking about how do we develop and design up and support team CQI processes. So I'm pretty close to wrapping up, but I just wanted to finish by just pointing out what it is that we need to do, I think, to put something like this in practice. And I guess a message that I would have is that we need to build and resource, particularly community organisations, to be able to take on board this kind of continual practice improvement kind of mindset and resource them to put in place the data collection capacities and the continuous learning processes that they need to have in place to be able to begin to not only I guess be seen as implementers of evidence-based practice, but to be seen as people, as organisations who are building evidence together with researchers. And what it means is a slight change of emphasis from thinking about the big new thing that we need to build in to beginning with existing systems and programs, and then asking ourselves, how can we make those existing systems and programs more effective, and then starting small thing by small thing on an improvement exercise. And that requires us to develop an innovation mindset and an openness to change. It requires us to draw on lots of different sources of knowledge, both knowledge that comes from randomised controlled trials, but also knowledge that comes from basic developmental science, knowledge that comes from local community know-how, practice knowledge, practice wisdom, and then pulling that together by becoming organisations that are learning and putting in place learning systems that have a comprehensive and a systematic approach to developing practice. Okay, I think that's I think that I need to wrap up there just in case there is time for questions. I feel like I've been going forever. So back over to you, Dale.
Thanks, Warren. I'll hand over to our GM Comms, Paul, who can help with any questions that have come in. We don't have any so far, so please do type your questions for Warren.
I'd start with a question, Warren, as the comms manager here at ARACY. I'm really interested in how we take, I think what you're talking about, a way I would see this, being an ex-political operative, is that I think take an evidence-based approach then provides evidence that an organisation or a program is effective and to be taken seriously. I just wonder if you can talk to the importance of this as a way of thinking and doing business.
Yeah.
Important it is to organisations to get over the final hurdle, which is convincing backbenchers and ministers and bureaucrats to give us money to invest in children and young people.
Yes, I think one of the side effects of the evidence-based practice movement, which has, is that there's a sort of almost a growing expectation, or at least a lot of, I think, organisations, agencies feel it, that they've got to be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of their programs at a kind of scientific level. And I think that where I'm at the moment is thinking that what researchers and scientists do is different to what a service does. Clearly, a researcher is trying to develop generalisable knowledge, whereas a service is about improving outcomes for the children and families who use that service. Sometimes the questions are even different. Now, it's not that there can't be wonderful and productive, connections and relationships between researchers and service providers, but I think the expectation that seems to be growing, whether that's real or perceived, that we have to be able to demonstrate the value of what we do using something like a randomised controlled trial. I feel that's an unrealistic expectation and maybe a little bit off the track. That's why I think the notion of improvement, I think the science of improvement, which is really starting to get legs and has been for a while now in health, I think that's what holds promise for organisations. And I think the use of data holds promise for organisations, but data used in a practical way, data that's used to show that we are hitting the outcomes that we're funded to hit, and that we are engaged in a continual learning and improvement process.
Thank you, Warren. We don't have any questions at this stage, so hang on. We've just had one come in. I'm just seeing if I can make good sense of it. I'll just read it to you verbatim, Warren. We'll see how we go. As a small regional organisation, our funding body is often looking for evidence-based practice that shows an outcome of value for money, as opposed to the value in positive outcomes for children in terms of health and well-being. How can we shift that conversation? Very good question, Tanya. Over to you, Warren.
Yeah, I know. And, I think that partly individual agencies alone are going to struggle to make that point. I think that's why a few of us need to get our voices out there and start to kind of introduce this. Because, look, first of all, I've welcomed the focus and attention on evidence-based practice, and particularly government embracing kind of notion of evidence-based practice. I think where we now need to move is to a slightly broader way of thinking about evidence-based practice. From a government's perspective, I think the critical thing is to see that the agencies that it funds are systematically collecting information that goes to their impact. Something like the program logic evaluation type framework that I talked about is a great, I think, starting point for something like that. So there's that demonstration of commitment to data, but then the second thing is that demonstration of commitment to using that data to keep improving the quality of what we do. I think that one problem that arises is when information which is collected for improvement is used to, I guess, hold people accountable. I think that's where we get distortions in this whole process. I mean, accountability is important, but I think we have to keep the two systems kind of separated. I can't resolve that in my own mind. I can't see how data that's used or collected primarily to learn and improve, if that suddenly becomes data which is used to evaluate, whether or not somebody has hit their targets or whatever. I think the room there is for that data to then to become I'm not talking about corruption, but it gets changed. It has a different purpose. There's a defensiveness which is introduced to it, which is sort of not really conducive to developing kind of a learning philosophy or a learning commitment. I don't know whether that helps. What do you think, Paul?
I think it does, Warren, and I think there's another question here that I think builds on that. And it's how do we? It says how we communicate practice data needs is complicated by who we're asking to collect the data. Do you have any thinking on how we can better educate staff who are collecting data? And I think that goes to your point about if I'm collecting data, is this going to be used to measure my performance as opposed to measure, outcomes or the efficacy of a program or piece of research?
Right. So look, partly what we have now is also a fairly long history and tradition of asking practitioners to collect data, which is used for evaluation purposes, but not ultimately made available back to the practitioners in a way that's actually helpful to them. And so, you know, if you're just collecting information which then disappears into a black hole, then it is hard to keep people interested in doing that. One of the things that we have done is in terms of developing, some fairly early attempts, really, I think, at data-informed continuous quality improvement approaches, is we have adopted the idea that we will only collect data that is potentially useful to the parent or the family as a whole. And so as we're assessing the use of tools, what we're doing is saying, could this tool support and reinforce the practice? Does it offer value to the family to be using the tool and thinking about it? Does it offer value to the professional? And this includes not just pre and post data, but continuous data. Data which is collected every session, or data which is collected every third or fourth session. Because it's too late finding out at the end that something didn't work for somebody. We need to be building in systematic ways of monitoring the impact of our intervention. And of course, there's the wonderful work being done by Miller and Duncan and others in the psychotherapy space around continuous measurement, which I think holds a lot of value for us. And again, the use of regular, almost session by session data collection, that is only going to be used by practitioners really when they can see how having this conversation is a really powerful thing to do, to check in a systematic way on a regular basis with how a parent feels about the progress they're making, or looks at perhaps their growing confidence. Allows for a conversation about how we're going, how we're tracking, what we might need to do differently, because it requires a great openness on the part of the practitioner. But it's just great practice to be able to do that. So I think, of course, it's reasonable to ask for an agency to be collecting information which goes to measuring outcomes, and that's important. But wherever possible, I think choosing measures which are, I guess, clinically, if that's the right word, that are actually therapeutic, potentially therapeutic in nature and useful, choosing that as a criteria for the selection of data is important. And the other thing too is, I think we have to create easy to use practical data collection techniques. And with the boom in online data collection options, where somebody can put data into an iPad or a tablet and have that data then just collected in a place that doesn't require data entry and so on, an additional burden on practitioners, then the sort of ease of data collection also, I think, has a significant effect on how we can kind of encourage people to become more data focused.
Thank you, Warren. There's a few questions coming in. Some of them I'm struggling a bit to decipher, but we're just about on time anyway. But I think what your talk has done, in part, has set off people thinking about highlighting the fact that data is difficult to collect. It can be difficult to get staff to collect data if they don't know what it's for, or they're concerned about what it might be used for. And also, I think just the clarity of thinking you've brought around thinking, collecting, say, performance measures as opposed to clinical or therapeutic or outcome measures. So I think that's been a really useful clarification in what you've given us today, Warren. So thank you. We will call it quits there. Thank you very much. That's been very informative, Warren, and you've really carried a load there. We've really put you to work for the last 50 minutes or so. So thank you very much, and thank you to the PRC for all the work you do, and particularly, and again on the comms front, on framing messaging. And for anyone who's not aware of the PRC's work on message framing, I really strongly recommend that all my colleagues in organisations that do the comms work in particular go and have a look at the PRC's website and look at the work that they're doing in framing. What framing is about is to ensure that when our people give us the good data, that we use it in a way that reinforces thinking that we want rather than reinforces thinking that we don't want. And it can be easier to reinforce thinking that we don't want than we imagine. So PRC is doing a great piece of work in that as well. So I recommend that to everyone on the line. Again, thank you, Warren, for the presentation and for taking our questions. Sorry to those questions we didn't get to. I did struggle to interpret what some of them meant. They will go to Warren, and if needed, he can follow up and answer those for you. The recording of this webinar will soon be available to ARACY financial members to stream online. It should be up by the end of the week, and keep an eye on our e-bulletin for a link to that. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining. There's lots of benefits of membership, including free access to our webinars and the recordings thereof, and also discounted registration to the Early Years Summit being held in March next year in Melbourne. Our next webinar will feature Beyond Blue CEO Georgie Harmon, who returns to talk to us about the learnings from year one of BU, their ambitious plan for mentally healthy learning in communities all over Australia. That webinar will be on the 12th of November at 12:30 p.m. Again, thank you, Warren. Thanks to the PRC for all the great work, and thank you everyone who's attended today. We'll see you at the next webinar.
Okay, bye.